Most of us concluded some time ago that Russian troops have been committing war crimes in Ukraine, but today Secretary of State Antony Blinken made it official, announcing the Biden administration has made a formal determination. Despite Russia's overwhelming military might, Ukrainian forces have started going on the offensive in some areas, appearing to gain back some ground in the cities they'd lost, and holding the line outside Kyiv as of this taping. But the situation across the country is grotesque. The Ukrainian government says some 100,000 people are still trapped in the city of Mariupol, where reports indicate somewhere around 80% of infrastructure there has been destroyed. Hundreds, if not thousands, of civilians have been killed by Russian troops, and there's real concern about how far Putin may go, including the possible use of chemical weapons.
How high is that threat?
I think it's a real threat.
Biden traveled to Brussels today for an emergency NATO summit where he's expected to announce new sanctions tomorrow against members of Russia's parliament. Then he'll head to Poland, where many of the estimated 3 million plus Ukrainian refugees have crossed the border. And as Biden surveys the wreckage so far of Putin's attack on a democratic nation, one of the key elements of our own democracy is playing out back on U.S. soil, with day 3 of Supreme Court nominee Ketanji Brown Jackson's confirmation hearing, where today she addressed a Trump-related ruling in which she declared that, quote, presidents are not kings.
Our constitutional scheme, the design of our government, is erected to prevent tyranny. That's a part of our constitutional design, and it prevents our government from being too powerful and encroaching on individual liberty.
Feels like a pretty relevant point given the state of the world today, and based on my first guest's role on a couple of impeachments, I'm quite sure he agrees. Congressman David Cicilline of Rhode Island helped investigate Donald Trump's efforts to withhold aid from Ukraine during House Democrats' first impeachment inquiry in 2019, went on to serve as an impeachment manager in the second. Also, as a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, he visited the Ukraine-Poland border a few weeks ago and got a preview of what the current president will be seeing in the coming days. Congressman, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Now, you serve on the Judiciary Committee, but in the House, so you won't get a vote. But I want to get your thoughts on the hearing. I have to say, I'm among those observers who felt like I'd gone to a QAnon convention with this all child pornography all the time. What's your takeaway from a day and a half?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's very clear that Judge Jackson is an extraordinary judge and will be an extraordinary Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. She displayed tremendous grace throughout the hearing, a very keen, thoughtful intellect. She dealt with, I think, some really silly and unfair questions in an effort to really smear her, I think. But despite all of that, I think they made fools of themselves, not of Judge Jackson. She is a former public defender, which I am as well. She understands the special role that lawyers play in our criminal justice system and how important it is that our Constitution requires that people be represented when they're accused of crimes. So I think she's going to bring a perspective and a viewpoint to the court that will be very valuable. It's obviously tremendously exciting to break this barrier and have the first African-American woman sit on the court. Yeah. But she is extraordinarily well qualified, in any effort to suggest otherwise, I think, is folly. And I think she proved that in the last 2 days of these hearings.
You know, one last thing about the hearings. I don't know if you heard Senator Lee from Utah bring up what he calls court packing, court expansion. I know you said not too long ago the party that packed the court are the Republicans who jammed through nominees and refused to consider Merrick Garland. But because of that, the resulting 6-3 conservative advantage has a bunch of Democrats talking about court expansion as a possibility. Where are you in that issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have quoted me correctly. The Republicans have packed the court by jamming through nominees without full hearings and a thorough investigation, and they denied Merrick Garland a seat on the court after President Obama appointed him to the Supreme Court. So they've packed the court. So I think the question about whether or not we need to rebalance the court and expand the court is an important one. The president created a committee to study the court and a whole series of court reforms. They've made some preliminary recommendations, but I've committed to waiting until the report is completed to make a determination. But I think we cannot have a Supreme Court that is so out of step with the direction of the country and which is making decisions that is really turning back the clock on fundamental civil rights and voting rights. And I think we have to look seriously at reforms that ensure that the court reflects the direction of the country and protects the Constitution and protects the rights of citizens in our country. And I think there's a lot of reason to be concerned about the direction of the court.
Well, briefly on that, I've had a couple of members of that commission on the show who said they're not going to make any formal recommendations. When you say we need to do something to rebalance, other than expansion, what could Congress do? And Congress could expand, and it has in the past. What could it do?
No, I think the Congress can expand the court. Congress could establish terms of service on the court rather than lifetime appointments. Congress could limit the jurisdiction of the court. So I think there are a number of reforms. If you look at the growing caseload of the court, that on its own might well justify additional justices on the court. So I think all those things ought to be on the table and carefully considered.
Let's move to Ukraine. Can you describe what you saw on your visit earlier this month to the Ukraine-Polish border? Yes.
It was really heartbreaking. We were at the largest border crossing between Ukraine and Poland. We're in a 9-day period. 1.5 million people had crossed the border for safety, mostly women and children. The men, of course, are remaining to fight. And so these women and children came across the border having just said goodbye to their fathers or husbands or brothers or sons, not knowing whether they would ever see them again. So they were terrified, and they were sometimes carrying a single bag or one roller suitcase of all their belongings. It was freezing cold, even a little light snow. Many of the people fleeing didn't even have winter coats. And it was really just horrific to hear the stories of people who just fled in the midst of bombing of their hometowns. This campaign by Vladimir Putin involves bombing of children's hospitals and residential neighborhoods and places where senior citizens live. I mean, unspeakable war crimes. And people are leaving because they feel like they have to leave in order to survive. And the Polish people have opened their country in their arms. There were people at the border cooking food, so they have a hot meal the minute they got into Poland, and other food and water and clothing and other supplies were donated, and lots of humanitarian organizations there to help folks find a place to safely stay. But this is just unspeakable what is happening. This is a brutal attack on a sovereign country, nothing anyone would expect to see in 2022.
When, I read another comment you made about you seeing Polish troops handing stuffed animals to children. It practically made me cry. Is the U.S. doing enough? I know there was a recent appropriation, $13 billion or so. Yeah. Are we doing enough?
Yeah, and there's no question the humanitarian crisis is great, and we've done a lot. We will continue to have to do more. I think, all of our European allies, our NATO allies are also doing their part. But it's going to take a lot to both deal with the humanitarian crisis and ultimately the rebuilding of Ukraine once this war is over. So I think this is something we have to commit to for the long haul. We're also, I think, thanks to the leadership of President Biden, who has really led the kind of reestablishment of a strong coalition to support Ukraine in their fight for their own democracy and their own sovereignty. You might remember the former president said, NATO was obsolete and really did a lot to damage our relationship with our NATO allies. President Biden, in a very short period of time, rebuilt those alliances. NATO is the strongest it's ever been. We are, and other NATO countries are providing tremendous support to Ukraine, both in lethal assistance, training, intelligence, arming them with ammunition and weapon systems so they can defend themselves. And they're doing a heroic job of doing it. I think I, like most people, think that we should do every single thing we can to support the Ukrainian people in this fight for their democracy, short of a declaration of war and the commencement of the Third World War. But I mean everything else. And
but Congressman, was there not a minute when you were on the border seeing this firsthand? I mean, I only see it from my couch at night and it's so unimaginably painful. When you were on the border seeing these individuals fleeing with nothing, leaving family behind, leaving pets behind, leaving their lives behind, isn't there a little piece of you that breaks down that World War three thing? I know that it's on the intellectual side of the brains of you and your colleagues and the president, but isn't there a piece of you that says maybe we do have to do more?
Oh, I don't think there's any question. It's not just for a minute. I think every single time any person, including me, sees those images. I was with my mother on Sunday and she said, "Can't you just stop it?" And I'm like, "Oh, Mom, I actually can't do that." But I think that's everyone's reaction. These are war crimes. I think the challenge is we want to do everything we can to stop it, but not make it worse for the Ukrainians and for the world, because the fear is escalation could ultimately lead to the use of tactical nuclear weapons, or even, or other additional weapon systems by Vladimir Putin. So I think what the president's trying to do is do everything we can to bring this war to an end and not provide opportunities for Putin to impose even greater damage and suffering to the Ukrainian people. And I don't think anyone can say with confidence, look, there's no way Vladimir Putin would use tactical nuclear weapons. I just don't think we can say that with certainty. So I think the president is trying to make sure we're doing everything we can short of that. I differ slightly from the president on the MiGs. I think, look, even though I agree that probably it's not the most necessary equipment that Ukrainians need right now, their morale, their fight is so critical that my view is whatever they ask for, we ought to make sure they get, because these are folks that are risking their lives to fight for their democracy. We ought to support them in every way.
Can I connect what you saw and those images we all see to another thing where you're a leader on this epidemic of gun violence in the country? Renee Graham in the Boston Globe today or yesterday wrote a piece that was titled, "Graphic Photos Are Defining the War in Ukraine with Similar Images Reignite America's Gun Reform Efforts." Should we show those images? Would it help with elected officials who have been stuck in the mud despite 20 dead 6- and 7-year-olds in Sandy Hook and Parkland? Would it change anything?
I don't know if it would. I'm all for it. I mean, I have found the lack of progress on responsible gun safety legislation to be the greatest frustration of my legislative work, both as a state legislator, as a mayor, and now as a member of Congress. I think it is principally due to the cowardice of folks who will not stand up to the powerful gun lobby and take them on. We have a number of bills in the House that ought to be passed right away. The Senate still hasn't passed universal background checks, which even gun owners overwhelmingly support. It's shocking and it's a disgrace. We have a gun violence epidemic in this country, and there's a lot more we could be doing and ought to be doing so that young people can go to school safely, so people can go to the theater or the mall or a synagogue or a church and not have to worry about being gunned down. This is a pandemic in America. This gun violence epidemic is peculiar to our country. There are more guns in America than there are people. It's something that we have got to take on and do something in a serious way.
I have less than a minute left, but speaking of refugees, there was a notable refugee from Eastern Europe decades ago who died today, the first woman Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright. Could you give me a quick reflection on Secretary Albright?
Yes. I mean, I had the privilege of working with her on a number of issues, and she was an extraordinary woman, broke the ceiling of being the first woman Secretary of State, but also was such a forceful voice for democracy and human rights around the world, warned about the growing totalitarianism around the world and our responsibility to stand up for our democracy. And we've lost a great intellect, a great leader, a magnificent person, and I feel very privileged to have known her.
David Cicilline, I really appreciate your time. I hope to see you back here again soon. Thanks for your time.
Thanks.